Hello. Good evening. Bonsoir. Buenos noches. Boa tarde. That's good afternoon in Portuguese. Does anyone know good evening in Portuguese? Me neither. Buonasera, right? Italian, maybe? Okay, I'm done. Hi, my name is Aaron Rosenblum. I'm the Health and Science Librarian here at the Portland Public Library. I'm really excited to welcome you to tonight's program in our sustainability series, which is co-hosted with the Southern Maine Conservation Collaborative. I have a couple notes and the library's land acknowledgement, and then I'm going to pass it to Jess Burton from Southern Maine Conservation Collaborative, and then we'll have our real guests up here. Quick things, the restrooms right outside of this auditorium should be open right now. So feel free to use them. There's a water fountain between the two of them. And let's see. Also, by the time this program is over, the library will be closed. So I want to tell you now at the beginning that at the end, please leave. You will go back out the way you came in. We'll have one of our safety staff up at the front door letting folks out. But just know that although we would love for you to come back and browse, 7 p.m. tonight will not be a time to browse in the stacks. It will be a time to go on with your evening somewhere that's not here. Before we go any further, I will do Portland Public Library's land acknowledgement, and that is that the Portland Public Library would like to acknowledge that the land on which we gather is the occupied and unceded territory of the Wabanaki, the people of the place where the sun first looks our way, who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. We extend our respect and gratitude to the many indigenous people and their ancestors whose rich histories and vibrant communities include the Abenaki, Mullaseet, Micmac, Passamaquoddy, and Penobscot nations, and all the native communities who have lived in Chewabunkeag for over 3,000 generations in what is now also called New England and the Canadian Maritimes. We thank them for their strength and resilience in protecting this land and aspire to uphold our responsibilities according to their example. So, with that, I will just add that we'll have a Q&A after the main part of the conversation. During that, I'll come around with this microphone or one very much like it. And if you're called upon, just wait for me to get to you with the mic so everyone can hear you. And that'll be for the best, I promise. So I would like to pass it off right now to Jess Burton, Executive Director of the Southern Maine Conservation Collaborative.
Thank you, Aaron. I'm Jess Burton with the Southern Maine Conservation Collaborative. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm just really thrilled always to be part of this series. We've been co-hosting this series for 5-6 years, and it's been a really great sort of process and illustration of all the things that are connected to conservation and to sustainability. And the purpose of our organization is really to help us think beyond the lines that we've drawn around our definitions of land and conservation, environment, sustainability. So I'm super glad to be here and to work with Aaron and the library. And I'm very excited for this conversation tonight. So I'm not going to spend any more time talking. I'm going to pass this mic over to Nick Fuller Googins, the author of The Night, author of The Great Transition. We all really need to do some more creative thinking about our future. So, Nick.
Thanks so much. Thank you all. I'm just so thrilled to be here, and it's such an honor. I'm going to talk a little bit about why the library in particular is such an honor, but also I feel like I'm just lonely up here on the stage because I'm in conversation here with two amazing activists and amazing scientists. So here, Dave and Ania, come on up too. Give them a round of applause too. Come on up, come on up. Okay, so thanks y'all. So we're each going to introduce ourselves, and then we're going to have a conversation about the greatest crisis that our planet has ever faced, but in a hopeful way. So that's our goal. That's my goal for tonight. So my name's Nick Fuller Googins. I am author of The Great Transition. This is my first novel. It's a climate crisis utopia, which I'll talk a little bit more about. And so I write for maybe like 30 or 45 minutes a day in the morning, and then for the vast majority of the day, I'm a fourth grade teacher in Saco, Maine. So I'm a proud member of the National Educators Association, the largest union in the country, and a proud member of the Maine Writers and Publishers Alliance. And I live in Biddeford, close enough to hear the ocean. So just sea level rise is on my mind a lot. I'll pass it on to you, Ania.
Thanks so much, Nick. And thanks so much to the Portland Public Library for having us, and for the Southern Maine Conservation Collaborative for organizing this, and to Nick for your awesome book. My name's Ania Wright. I use she, her pronouns. I'm based in Portland. I work with a couple organizations, but namely Sierra Club Maine, which is the Maine chapter of the National Sierra Club. And so we work here in Maine to protect and advocate for our environment and the people of Maine, and for climate justice. And there I work as a legislative and political specialist. So yeah, working to advocate for good policy here in Maine and for some champion environmental candidates. And then I also, my roots are really in the youth climate justice movement, and I've worked really closely with Maine Youth for Climate Justice, which is a coalition of youth groups from all over the state working on climate justice here in Maine. And I think that's about it, and I'll pass it over to Dave.
Yeah, good evening, folks. I'm Dave Reidmiller. I lead the Climate Center at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute. Many of you may be aware of the big gray building on the waterfront next door to Becky's. But GMRI is an 80-person nonprofit that develops and delivers collaborative solutions to global ocean challenges. And the foremost global ocean challenge of our time, of course, is climate change. So I was thrilled 3 years ago when GMRI decided to launch a climate center to really start to address that issue at a local and regional level. My background is as a climate scientist, specifically an atmospheric chemist. So if you have any air pollution questions, happy to talk about those. But after grad school, got really interested in kind of the science policy nexus, moved to Washington, worked in the Senate, and then in the White House, and then in the State Department, where I led U.S. negotiations on science and technology for the Paris Agreement, and then soon after moving here, served as a climate advisor to the Biden-Harris presidential transition team. So always sort of keeping a foot in the science domain, while also, like Ania, being in the policy domain as well. And just thrilled to be here in Maine and be a part of this conversation tonight, especially to celebrate Nick on the huge accomplishment of getting this book published.
Thanks, y'all. So I wanted to start out this conversation just thinking a little bit broader, and wanted you to try to envision this. If I was to propose, I had this proposal for a decentralized network across the country of about 17,000 community hubs in all different communities, and each of these hubs would be like completely independent, but would respond just to its community's needs. And it would offer like tech services and have lunches for kids during the summer, and coding camps, and provide literacy support, and it would all be 100% or almost 100% publicly funded. Like, this would seem like a big aspirational idea, and this is the United States library system. And so I have taken a step back since writing a utopia, and I've just been noticing all the utopias that exist around us that I started to realize I was taking for granted. A big one is the public school I work in. We welcomed in a number of refugee students last year, free breakfast, free lunch, free transportation. The school is heated. A kid in my class is experiencing homelessness. The school is getting them supplies, helping out, free social work. And then I found out recently that in 1848, free and universal public education was the 10th point on the Communist Manifesto. It was considered such a radical idea that we would fund the education of strangers, that it was on the Communist Manifesto. It was considered completely implausible, utopian, it's never going to happen, and now it's a bedrock of our society. And so I just wanted to start with that because it's a really scary time we live in. I've been researching this book and thinking about the climate crisis for years, and it can be paralyzing. I've felt despair. I've felt like we're never going to get out of this problem. There's solutions, but we're just in this political deadlock, and there's no hope. And then I remember that, like, humanity, we are so flexible, we're so creative. If there's anything we do, it's that we change. And utopias have been created before, and utopias will be created again. And when I say utopia, I'm not talking about it in the sense of something unrealistic, but something aspirational that we're moving towards, and we may never reach, but in that process, we're bettering the world. So I've become clearly a hardcore member of Team Utopia from writing this book. And it all came about when I was working on a solar crew of a small company called Sundog Solar that operates out of Searsport in the Mid-Coast. And it was 2018, and I was installing solar panels, and I really loved the work. I love working outside and with my hands, but the timing was amazing because this happened to be the summer that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had won her upset primary, and it was the first time I'd ever heard of this term, the Green New Deal. This plan we're going to talk a lot, I hope, a lot tonight about this plan to put tens of millions of people to work to try to turn around the disaster that is the climate crisis. And for the first time, I felt hope of what we could do if we mobilized as a country. And so I started fantasizing, like, as I would be driving home from work, I'd start to think, well, what if I, like, enlisted in this and I could be part of the Solar Corps, and what would it be like to spend, like, 3 or 5 years trying to save the world, and imagine, like, what I would be able to tell, you know, my grandkids someday to be a part of a movement like that. And obviously the Green New Deal hasn't happened yet, but the fiction part of my brain just kind of ran with that, and that became the premise of this book. The Great Transition is a fictionalized version of the Green New Deal, and it follows one family both through the transition and then in the aftermath, and kind of a utopian world that is now under threat. So I just wanted to put that out there because I'm really coming at this from a view of hope amidst a very scary time. But I'm also, as the book does too, acknowledging the very, very stark, scary reality that we are facing. And until we are coming up with being able to talk about solutions, we need to really know the threat that we are under. So, this is a big job, Dave, but as the scientist up here, can you give us, like, kind of like this, a state of the planet, what's going on? Don't pull any punches. How are we doing?
Yeah, not great, not great. I don't think, yeah, you need to be a scientist to know that. But if you look back, you know, basically in the pre-industrial era started either 1750, 1850, however you want to slice it. And atmospheric CO2 concentrations back then were on the order of, what, maybe 270, 280 parts per million or so, right? We're now at 420 plus parts per million. And it's really important to know that, yes, you know, over the course of geological timescales of the Earth, atmospheric concentrations of CO2 have gone up and down, and sometimes they haven't been quite this high, but they've been, you know, in the upper 300s or almost 400 or so. The difference, however, is that those changes occur, well, a couple differences. One, there were no humans on Earth, so nobody had really acclimated to a particular climate. And two, that those changes occurred over millions of years. We have managed to alter the composition of our atmosphere in a matter of centuries, almost really decades, if we're being honest about it. And what that means is that the natural systems of the world have not had an opportunity to adapt or to catch up and figure out, okay, how do I exist in this warmer world, right? Similarly, humanity hasn't. And humanity, despite knowing what the causes are, is now starting to deal with the very real consequences, right? And so globally, temperatures are about 1.1, 1.2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial times right now. And so for those that don't work in the metric system, that's about 2.5 degrees or so, maybe a little less. But really, that may not seem like a lot to most people. They're like, I can't tell the difference between a 76-degree pool and a 78-degree pool. But the better analogy, perhaps, is thinking about yourself and the human body, right? We are a complicated system with a whole bunch of organs that work in really complicated ways together, just like the Earth system has a bunch of different ecosystems that work together in really complicated ways, many of which we still don't fully understand. And they're really optimized to a very narrow temperature range, right? Just like our body is. And when we run a temperature of a couple of degrees, we start to feel a bit lethargic. If we start to run a temperature of 4 or 5 degrees, systems are going to start to shut down, and you're going to end up in the hospital. And that's kind of the trajectory we're on planet Earth. And I'll just say that we as a global society have enormously disparate impacts when it comes to this, right? And so I don't need to go through the whole list of all the impacts. You guys read the headlines as much as I do, but I think it's really important to know that yes, we in kind of mid-latitudes, developed world are pretty well insulated from many of the risks from climate change. We're still going to feel them. There's no doubt about that. But look at the people in the lower latitudes in particular. Look at the people that are in developing countries or even within our own communities that don't have the access to services or resources and things like that to really build their resilience. And I think that really kind of unveils kind of the justice angle that I think is just so important to hit on when we really think about what we, a small group of humanity, have really caused to happen in this world.
One book that I used to kind of like try to plan out the near future was a book called The Uninhabitable Earth. And that reporter talks about, he had looked at all these different trajectories of where the world could go based on our actions now. Like the best case scenario being dropping emissions to zero immediately. The worst case scenario being we just do nothing and keep on our current path. So do you, and Ania, maybe you know too, like I guess I'm wondering, or either of you, where we, between that spectrum, like where are we headed? And like maybe to bring it home a little more, like what, I know it's hard to make predictions, but what might it look like based on our current trajectory here in Maine, I don't know, 30, 40, 50 years from now? Is that possible to answer this question? A lot of these questions, by the way, are things that I am genuinely curious to, that I just wanted to bring to you all.
Certainly, you're the international climate policy expert with the Paris Agreement work. But the Paris Agreement, set out the recommendation that we stay below 1.5 degrees of warming in order to maintain the society that we have today, and we're already at 1.2, and are projected to reach that 1.5 degrees pretty quickly. So yeah, as Dave said, things are not looking great. And getting to that equity piece, about 100 companies are responsible for 71% of global emissions. And as Dave was saying, about kind of the inequity between us in the U.S. and the rest of the world, developed countries like the United States are responsible for the majority of historical emissions, and so there's a need there for us to be doing more than we're doing right now, and I know that's straying from your question.
Yeah, no, it's like bringing up the Paris Accord. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the last I had read, 0 of the world's top emitters were on track to reach their goals. Is that true?
Depends on how you measure it, of course. But I think so. If you look at where we were, now 8 years ago when the Paris Agreement was passed, we were probably at about, I don't know, somewhere around 45 to 48 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. A gigaton is 1 billion tons, and the U.S. currently is responsible for maybe about 12% of that. as Ania pointed out, historically we're responsible for at least a quarter of it. China is by far the biggest emitter currently. But we haven't stopped emissions globally, right? We haven't even stopped the growth in emissions globally. So an analogy I like to use is one of a bathtub, right? Where you basically have the tub itself is the atmosphere. The water are all the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, fluorinated gases. And what we've been doing since 1850 is just turning that faucet higher and higher and higher. And so more and more water's falling into that tub. What we're starting to do, which is good, is reduce the rate that we're turning that knob. But water's still coming out and filling up that tub. And so we're getting to a point where emissions globally, we're almost at, hopefully, peak emissions, right? And there's been, global aspirations to reach peak emissions by 2030. I think that's a pretty ambitious goal, but it's not impossible. But again, all that means is that we've stopped the increase. We're still putting stuff in the atmosphere and warming up this planet. And that's why, achieving net zero is so important. Driving that emission, bending that curve, right, as quickly as possible is so important. And we're not there yet. I will say that the EU, their emissions have certainly come down, certainly since the early 90s, probably by about 20 or so percent. U.S. emissions, we met our Copenhagen target in 2020, which was a reduction of 16 to 18% below 2005 levels, so we did achieve that. Our 2025 goal, I believe, was on the order of, you probably know better than I do, maybe at this point, I should know it, 40% maybe? No, 30%. And that's a stretch goal. But I will say that, the IRA bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the IIJA, some big pieces of major federal legislation that have gone through the past couple of years. There's been modeling done, particularly out of a group from Princeton, that does suggest that if we fully implement those laws over the coming years and sort of increase some of the regulations that EPA has power over, say, for fuel economy standards in light-duty and heavy-duty vehicles, we can reach those pretty ambitious 2030 targets and could get us on a track to net zero by mid-century. But that would, again, require extraordinary measures.
And I think there's an interesting kind of discussion to be had, too, about what's politically possible, what's scientifically necessary, and then what's equitable and fair, too. When you look at talking about the U.S.'s, responsibility when it comes to the climate crisis, there's an international group called U.S. Climate Fair Shares, and their estimate is that the U.S., in order to, pay reparations to the global South and reduce emissions in a way that's equivalent to the amount that we've produced, we should be reducing our emissions by 195% by 2030, which is sounds ridiculous when you compare it to what has been passed politically, but then when you look at what's been passed politically, that's been a stretch from what's politically possible. So I think, and it gets back to Nick, your kind of original question and queries about the system change that's needed and kind of the different ways that we need to start thinking about these solutions because, the political, our political systems can only move so quickly.
I want to get into those solutions. I just want to make, so this is, I guess sometimes I have this feeling where there's these kind of, this false optimism in the media right now. So we often, and I want to talk more about the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill because we keep hearing it discussed as the biggest climate bill ever in the history of the United States, which is 100% true, and it is also about 1% of what experts think is needed for a really true, just transition. We also hear about how the US is dropping emissions so much, and we don't often hear about how exports of coal and oil and gas are going up. So it's like this shell game it makes me think of sometimes. It's like almost like a drug dealer not touching the product, but just shifting it around to other people. And because it's a global problem, like you're saying, Davis, the bathtub. And last year, like the fact is, was the largest emissions ever in the history of the Earth at a time when we need to be dropping them. So I just want to front load this conversation with all the like seriousness of what we're facing, because my kind of view after looking at this and thinking about different solutions was that this kind of incremental market-based approach, while it will kind of bend the curve, is not nearly enough to spare us from the worst of the climate crisis. So I would love to, but in like, just to bring it real close to home, this past school year, I'm only 3 weeks into the year, and it feels like 3 months, because our first week of school, my school was built 100 years ago when, I don't know, what were the parts per million in 1923?
Yeah, right.
No one ever imagined it could be this hot. On the 5th day of school, my principal came in, and we were told, along with a number of classes, we cannot teach, our classroom is not safe to teach in anymore. It was 92 degrees. Some of my kids went home and were sick and were throwing up. Classes went to teach in the cafeteria or had to go outside where it was, only in the mid-80s. It's really scary. So I just want to really, accentuate the extreme situation that we are facing right now, because it's time for some really big solutions. And so, Ania, I was hoping you could start us off on that conversation of when you talked about balancing hope and despair, and justice-centered solutions. And so what do you see as kind of like, let's just dream big, like best case scenario, what would some of these huge solutions look like?
Let's see. Yeah, so, we've gotten to this place because of this profit-driven, growth-oriented systems that we've created, and systems based on the exploitation of resources, the exploitation of people, high consumption, and these really just exploitative, economic and social structures, and based in these real power imbalances between, the haves and the have-nots, however that's defined in the particular situation. And so there are so many systems that we need to be changing, and I think the thing that feels really exciting to me about addressing the climate crisis is that it is so intertwined with all these other crises that we're facing, both here in Portland, here in Maine, here in the US, and globally. Crises around poverty, around health, around racism, sexism. They're all tied into these bases of exploitative structures that have led us to the climate crisis. So there's real opportunity to not only address the climate crisis, but also to address these other systemic issues that we have. So that is exciting. I think there are so many different solutions out there, and that's also exciting. The things that we need to do and to implement in order to solve the climate crisis, they exist. And we just need to both garner the social power to make them possible, and just create movements for change, locally, nationally, globally, which sounds easier than it really is.
Yeah, no, I mean, I will add that I actually find a ton of hope in this moment, because we have all the technology we need, like you mentioned. We have all the money we need. Like, if we think the government can't just print money, like, look what happened in April of 2020, right? Just printing money, it's fine. Like, if we need to do it, we do it in a wartime kind of mobilization. And we have all the people we need, the manpower. Like, this book, all the research that went into it, all the technology in the future, it's all stuff that is already existing. Like, there's something called the gravity storage warehouse that will it's a way to harness solar power when it's dark out. And I heard the first one just came online, I think, in China. And so that gives me a lot of hope too. Because sometimes I imagine, what if we were staring down the barrel of this crisis, and we were like, we don't have the technology we need, and we're trying to race among all the other problems to invent this new technology. But like you're saying, it's already there.
And a lot of it isn't even new technology. It's
right.
going back, it's,
That's
you
so
know,
true,
going
yeah.
back to ways of living that we had, you know, decades or centuries ago, going back to, you know, more organic farming practices, and looking at mass transportation as opposed to individual transportation, things that were emphasized in the past and worked, but then because of the ways that our society values individualism and consumption, we've gotten away from. So it's both, yes, investing in technology, but also changing our ways of thinking and living together.
So you're just join me on this kind of like fiction envisioning for a moment. But in this book, a catastrophe happens, a climate catastrophe, and it creates kind of a momentary political alignment. If this happened, realignment, if this happened and we had the same kind of mobilization that we saw after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, when everyone is on board and is seeing this together as an emergency, like what would kind of a dream list look like? Like what, with the full power of the federal government harnessed, what kind of things would be like most exciting that we would need as fast as possible? What kind of mobilizations? I just like to, maybe I'm trying to reverse engineer it. Like what would the best case scenario look like? Let's just dream for a second.
If you look at sources of emissions in the U.S., we're actually an outlier country. I think we are, certainly among developed economies, we are the only economy whose emissions are dominated by transportation. And that just happened within the past decade. Historically, our emissions were dominated, like most other countries, developed countries, by electricity production, power production, right? But because we pivoted so significantly from coal to natural gas as a result of fracking, which introduces all sorts of other issues, we were able to decrease our power sector emissions, and as a result, our transportation sector emissions are now a larger slice of the pie. So in terms of what would I want to see for kind of large national policy, it would be multifold, right? It would certainly be a bunch of investment in mass transit and sustainable communities. You know, the 15-minute city issue that's been coming up a lot more, particularly in the UK. Yeah, fuel economy standards, you know, widespread charger deployment, and obviously incentives for EVs would be a big piece of it. Obviously, the need for renewables is huge. You know, we have really large tax credits that are part of the IRA and BIL that are really incentivizing the construction of utility-scale renewable facilities, whether they be solar or wind. The challenge, of course, is that we have a grid that is a century old and cannot really take on both the amount of new power, the intermittent nature of that power, to say nothing of the resilience of that system to increasingly strong storms. So we need massive investment in our electrical grid, and obviously ratepayers are not exactly keen to pay for it. Companies obviously aren't going to do it out of their own goodwill. They would pass it on to ratepayers, so I would argue that there's a great role for the federal government to just buy us a new grid, you know? So I think those are two huge things that would be big. The other thing that I think doesn't get enough airtime is simple efficiency, simple energy efficiency. Weatherize your homes, you know, pump up your tires, you know, all these smaller things that when you add them up, they're actually these small wedges that when you combine them together can actually result in pretty significant energy savings. The final thing I'll just say on this point is that we live in a society, both in Maine, in the US, where we experience wild oscillations in our political environment, right? Both at the state and the federal level, which really undermines our ability to make progress on climate action. And it's not just the policy that's being promulgated at the federal level, it's the signal that's being sent to the private sector. Where should they invest, in their R&D? And that, to me, is a real challenge of our system, as opposed, say, to somewhere like China, where they have really efficient centralized planning in China, and if there's a policy that they want to promulgate, they can make that happen pretty effectively. And the challenge when the U.S. steps back from taking a global leadership role is that it gives an excuse, an out, for the Chinas of the world to do the same. And that's exactly what you saw happen in the wake of the Paris Agreement.
I was thinking a lot about like utopian visions as a way of kind of like re-sparking our vision of what is possible. And weirdly enough, sometimes looking into the past can do that. And so just speaking of like industrial mobilization, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, FDR made an announcement that he wanted the United States to produce 60,000 planes in 2 years. And a lot of industry captains said that was impossible and scoffed at it. He signed and invoked the War Powers Act. So instead of just a carrot for companies, like here's a tax incentive, here's a grant, here's a loan forgiveness program, it's more of a stick, as I understand it. Like, you have to do this because it's an emergency. So the goal is 60,000 planes, and within 3 years, the United States had produced 200,000 planes. That kind of mobilization was possible in 1941. And then the other thing that I just came across recently, which just blew my mind, that I had to read it a couple times because I thought I had misread it and I had to find another source, was that when FDR, by executive order, signed the Civilian Conservation Corps into law, or when he signed that executive order, and this is the CCC that ended up putting over 3 million Americans to work at public lands all across the country. So get this is going to be a bunch of numbers in a row, but it's blew my mind. Within 3 days after signing that executive order, the CCC had already enrolled its first recruits. Within 1 week, they had established their first camp in George Washington National Forest. Within 3 months, over 300,000 people were at work over 1,400 camps across the country. And yes, like, the conditions were different then. There was a lot more unemployment, maybe more Americans were used to manual labor. But I think we saw, if this can happen in 1933 with no interstate highway system or satellites or GPS or internet, to think that, like, it's 2023, like, can't we dream bigger? Like, couldn't we have like a federal corps going around like weatherizing people's homes, like a rapid expansion of job training to like meet this for the emergency that it is? Like, that's the kind of thing that I don't know, I just look in the past, like we did this almost 100 years ago. I don't know, couldn't we do it now? Is there anything, Ania, that would be like on your dream wish list? If the floodgates opened, a climate emergency is declared, we're facing this like a wartime mobilization, like what would you hope to see?
Well, I totally agree with Dave with what he was talking about, and I think, yeah, I mean, there's so many things that need to happen all at once. I think the Climate Corps model is such a fascinating model and something that has so much potential to really mobilize and train a workforce for the climate crisis, and I think that would be a huge piece of the puzzle. And I think it is a huge piece of the puzzle now. Maine passed a bill last session to create the Maine Climate Corps. It's yet to be funded. Call your representatives and senators. And the intention with that is to have a corps like Nick was talking about, having young Mainers being trained in the trades, in climate-ready jobs to be helping with this transition. And I think that's such a huge piece and gets to that intersectionality point that I was making earlier. In order to do this transition right, we need it not only to be a great transition, like your book is titled, but it needs to be a just transition. And so what I mean by that is we need people to be better off with this transition than they were before. And that means not only creating tons and tons of climate jobs, but making sure that they're good jobs, making sure that they're family-sustaining jobs. And I think we're set up really well to do that with a program like a Climate Corps program. And there's programs like that already exist in Maine too, through our union workers with their apprenticeship programs. We have a huge need for more young people to be taking on trade jobs. In my work with the Sierra Club, that's often one of our biggest hurdles is just getting people connected to organizations or businesses that actually have capacity to come to them to weatherize their homes, because they have such long wait lists because the job market is so small right now. But anyways, that's a tangent. I think just transition's a huge piece. I think ensuring access to clean water and food sovereignty is another huge piece of the puzzle. Transportation, as Dave said. In Maine, 54% of our emissions come from transportation, which I don't know what the percentage is at the national scale, but I think—
More than that, yeah.
Yeah, it's really bad in Maine. And my amazing grandmother's here in the audience, but she used to come to Maine growing up by train all the way up to the mid-coast, and that doesn't exist anymore. And why is that? So I think that's a huge piece of the puzzle. And then I think climate finance and climate debt is the other piece as well. Getting back to that, what is the U.S. responsible for on a global scale, and how can we use our immense wealth as a nation to make sure that we're doing our due diligence and holding ourselves accountable as a country to this situation that we've largely created.
Yeah, this is a good kind of bridge to this question, especially as a sustainability series. So in my book, in the near future, the living climate criminals are being hunted down, very similar to like what happened in Europe after World War II, where Israel had a covert death squad that assassinated over hundreds of Nazi officers. So when I talk about like climate criminals, sometimes I'll get people say, well, we're all climate criminals because we all use fossil fuels. We're all responsible for this. And so and sometimes I'll see too, when some like talk about the book online, people will be chiming in like very concerned about the environment and the climate, and they'll say, like I recycle, I use a metal straw, I bike when I can. What role does personal sustainability do you all think has at this point in where we are in the crisis? And I'll also just add in that, right, we also see like Chevron, the oil giant, producing ads like telling us to worry about our climate footprint. And so—
They invented that term, by the way.
No way, really? Wow, I didn't know that Chevron invented the term. That's amazing. And again, I'm asking this in all sincerity because it's something that I struggle with too. Like, is there any room for personal sustainability in solving the climate crisis, or is it become more of a kind of like spiritual self-help, something important but more for us and how we're coping with things? I don't know, either of you. What do you think?
I don't think we have the luxury of choosing anymore. I think all actors need to play a role, and I think, as Ania's made the point, people have different capabilities to take action, right? And those that have more capacity to act, have the responsibility to do so. It's, it's the classic kind of tragedy of the commons issue, right? And so everybody needs to do something to preserve the collective atmosphere, right? And the collective earth that we share, the oceans that we share. And, I think obviously there's corporate action is a necessity, but I think individual action can ultimately oftentimes catalyze corporate action, and you see that through, say, for lack of a better phrase, activist shareholders that really kind of push companies to disclose information or to take particular action. You see that in competitive elections from the local level to the federal level, right? Activating the voting constituency. You know, if a person, you know, has apprehension about getting an electric vehicle because they have range anxiety or aren't sure how it works, you know, if your neighbor has it and you see your neighbor driving it around, you say, oh, okay, maybe I can do that too. So I think there is a real role for individual action, but it certainly cannot supplant, despite Chevron's best efforts, corporate action for sure. And to that end as well, you know, the everything in between, right? Institutional actors writ large, whether they're universities, you know, municipal governments, everything.
Yeah, I think it's a complicated question, and Dave, you're just definitely getting to some points that I was thinking about. You know, I think it depends on how you define action. When you look at, you know, the carbon footprint, for lack of a better term, of someone from the U.S., I believe we emit on average about 13 tons of carbon individually as people in the U.S., whereas someone from Mozambique emits about 0.0005 tons of carbon. So there is a huge disparity, and, you know, opportunities for us as Americans to limit our carbon emissions. But that being said, I'll go back to the factoid that I shared at the beginning. You know, 71 companies, or 100 companies are responsible for 71% of emissions globally, and that's not you or me. And so when you look at, you know, the actual responsibility of who needs to be emitting less, it's a lot less pressure on individuals and more on these systems that we're a part of. So I think in terms of what is important for individual action, I think getting informed and staying informed is really a huge piece of the puzzle for me, especially about local climate issues. You know, I think about the Pine Tree Power Question 3 initiative that's going to be on the ballot this November 7th, and that's something that CMP and Versant, who you know, are backed by fossil fuel companies, are pouring millions and millions of dollars into disinformation campaigns and getting folks to vote no, when really, you know, doing due diligent research as a voter, you'll find, or I'll find at least, that the real climate solution is to vote for these transformational changes. So I think for me, that's where the individual action piece comes in the most, is understanding your place in this, in the systems that you're a part of, and yeah, understanding where the truth lies, I think.
People ask me sometimes what, you know, what can we do for the climate? And here in Maine, on all the stops that I've done for my book, I say, like, we're actually really lucky if you're feeling paralyzed and there's nothing to do, because November 7th, is that the date? November 7th is the referendum, the election, and I've heard it being pitched as the most important climate election in the whole country this year, because all the utilities from around the whole country and other states are watching what we do here in Maine. And I had learned that of all the communities in the United States that have 100% renewable energy, the one thing they have in common is they're all consumer owned, which isn't that shocking, because, right, like CMP, they have to make profits for their shareholders. They're not in it to create renewable energy. I remember when I used to live in Los Angeles, which is owned by DWP, I think probably the largest public utility in the country, I'm guessing. But we would get like delivered to our door like more efficient light bulbs and like shower heads and things like that, because their goal is to reduce the total, you know, output. Anyway, that was just a segue, but the Pine Tree Power is like 100% the best thing that any of us can do, like, or I should say, like, the easiest thing that any of us can do right now in the state, for sure, to vote for it, contribute, you know, phone bank, knock on doors. I was using out of state. I was using my book tour to raise money for the campaign. And so in New York and Massachusetts, and raising a bunch of cash to help out. And I want to, I guess I'm just looking at the time, and there's I feel like I could want to talk with you all for hours up here. But I guess I would love to know what, like Dave, as a scientist, looking at the numbers, like what gives you the most hope looking forward here?
Yeah, I think two things. One is, as Ania highlighted early on, we have the solutions, right? It's not like we're trying to tackle cancer or something like this where we don't have the answer. We know the causes, we know the solutions. So to me, that in and of itself gives you hope. The other thing is that there's so much momentum now, right? And that's, that's, you could look at that two different ways, you as I do. Spatially, across the world, right, there's a growing awareness and action is being taken, even if it's not nearly fast enough. But also intergenerationally, right? And so you have kind of a youth now that has grown up with this issue at the forefront of their minds, and they are, for lack of a better phrase, spitting fire over taking action, and frankly pissed off at people for not acting more quickly. And so, to me, that is going to catalyze change, right? And so there's reason for hope because we have the solutions and we have the momentum. I think the real question is, can that momentum be sustained, and can we really act fast enough? To me, that's, as soon as I get that hope, I get that God, but the climate train is still moving. We're still seeing these deadly heat waves across the world. We're seeing these more powerful storms. We're seeing these droughts. We're seeing sea level rise. We're seeing the ice sheets collapse. We're seeing coral reef bleaching. Tick, 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 tick. And so, but we have the answers.
Yeah, and I think what you're talking about when things are moving fast, like we forget, and it really feels like we're just stuck in this, like politically as a country. It's hard to imagine things happening, but in human history and even modern human history, when things change, they change so fast. I had just interviewed Kristen Godsey, who wrote an amazing book called Everyday Utopias. Because if you can't tell, I'm kind of obsessed with utopia. And in it, it talks a lot about this, how quickly things can change, even when we think it's impossible. And she talks about people thought this for feudalism and slavery and monarchy. It's like this, there's no way it's ever going to change, and then it changes so fast. And she had talked about interviewing some families from Eastern Europe, so, not related, but different people around Eastern Europe who had family members commit suicide a week before, this was in East Germany, a week before the Berlin Wall had fallen, and talking about communism's never going to end, I'm never going to see Paris, I'm never going to be free, and they never could have imagined that had they waited 1 week, everything would change. And so I think that's just so important to keep in mind, that there is some momentum, and that when it picks up, it can move so fast that we could be so shocked by it. One of the things in this book that happens that might be the most, in some ways, the hardest to believe of all this utopian stuff that happens, is that in this political realignment, a third party is elected. And so in some ways, they're like, well, I could believe everything else, but to us, it seems like completely unimaginable. But I guess, Ania, as the organizer, and you've been involved with so many political causes, I look at our two-party system, and I see the Republican Party pretty much hostile to any big climate solutions, and then I see the Democratic Party, Biden approving new oil projects in the Arctic. The first 2 years of his presidency, more oil and gas permits were approved than during the first 2 years of the Trump administration. We see these two parties, we're not seeing some big movement. I don't know, what do you see as kind of a way to kind of break this logjam? Are we thinking third party, progressive primary, state? I don't know what, again, I'm asking because I want to know.
Yeah, what a good question, and something that books have been written on. Hard to answer quickly, but I think, between huge grassroots mobilization, between new power within the current political systems that we have, or a third party power, something's got to change, something's got to give, and I don't have the perfect recipe or solution for what's next or what needs to come, but something's got to change on our, political spectrum, both federally and here in the state. Yeah.
Having worked in the upper reaches of...
Yeah, well, I think, you started this all by teeing up AOC and the Green New Deal and everything, and I think when she first came on the national kind of scene, it was like, wow, she's hyper-progressive, this is dangerous, this is unknown, how's this going to play out? And what you saw, I think, which was really helpful, is that she pulled the entire discourse, right? Even if, I don't know if she firmly ever believed that the Green New Deal in and of itself would ever actually become law of the land, but what she did was pull the discourse, and that is really important. We need those people in society, because without that, without her, without the Green New Deal, the seeds that did become, the bipartisan infrastructure law and the IRA, they probably would have been far less ambitious, even if we wanted more out of it, So I think there's something to be said about just that momentum being pulled, and we see that, Republicans are kicking and screaming, but the tune that they sing about climate change has evolved over time, right? And that's noteworthy, right? The tune that oil companies sing over time has evolved, right? Obviously, it's not where it needs to be in order to solve the problem, but change is happening, and it's because of strong, polarity really pulling that discourse, and that's a really important dynamic that we have in the U.S.
So cool. I know we're not done yet, but I did want to make sure if there's anybody who had a question for Dave or Ania or myself. And also Dave brought this up, which I thought was a really good idea too, is that we'd love to hear, and I'm sure all of us would, of thinking about the climate crisis, like, what concerns you, or what are you worried about? What other ideas have you heard about? So I guess I'd say, usually I think in a lot of these are like no, you hear like no comments, only questions, but maybe now comments and questions.
I have a question, but I can't be the only one, and
I have a lot.
I
more
could go
too.
later, or I could go first to open things up. Oh, here. Not until you have the microphone, please.
Just a quick mention that for a quick reference that I just really like Science Friday with Ira Flato. It's a national public radio program, and they have a podcast that you can go and get first-person interviews with researchers, with all sorts of politicians and stuff at times, but it's based on a long arc of a great NPR legend, really, Ira is now, but as a reference tool for people. It's long form, they run 10-minute plus interviews, but it's a great touchstone for people to get separate either climate change or just different types of things. And I'd just be circumspect about being appreciative of the steps that have been made. I realize people want more change, but it's tough, and it's a tough thing. So I think your comments at the end. Your first name again? I'm sorry. I'm a moderate, okay, more of a moderate person, but just remember that things like heat pumps. I think it's up to 20,000 heat pumps have been installed here in the state, and now nationally millions are going to be installed. Practical things are happening, and just listen to some Science Friday shows about it, some podcasts. So there you go.
And check out books on science and the climate crisis from the Portland Public Library. But yeah, I could here. Science Friday with Ira Flato from National Public Radio.
Just a couple other sources of good information for kind of climate and energy news. The Washington Post has a daily news digest called Climate 202 or Energy 202. Really good stuff about kind of latest breaking kind of both policy and technology. New York Times has one called Climate Forward, which is kind of a twice or three times weekly digest. Bloomberg Green is a really good newsletter that focuses largely on kind of what's happening in the private sector, where investments being made, where are technological breakthroughs happening. And then Politico has a daily newsletter called Power Switch, which really looks at kind of energy policy at the federal level. So those are a few that I tend to read pretty much daily, and I find them to be super useful. So to complement Science Friday, which I wholly endorse as well, those are a few other resources.
Question for you, Nick, about choosing to write about utopias and how it feels like dystopian novels have been really popular to sort of get us ready for the dystopia. And I have found myself really wanting a different telling of the future. And so I just wanted to hear from you, it feels like there are not that many utopian novels. And so, like, did you feel, were you worried? Or how did you feel like the motivation to actually write a whole book and then get it out there and, all that?
Yeah, so that summer 2018, when I thought, I was like, I just want to write a utopian novel. I think, like, I've taught for so many years. In, like, literally today, in our writing unit, the kids are writing stories, and it's like, what is your character's desire, but then what's the struggle? And like, okay, we're just going to throw as many problems as we can in there because we know that's what makes a great story. So right away, I was like, well, what will be the conflict in this if everything works out? If that's the world, it seems kind of boring. And so I, as a blueprint or as a model, went to the novel The Dispossessed by the science fiction writer Ursula K. Le Guin, which I love her. She's probably my literary hero. And this was the only utopia I knew. And so and what I got from her, the craft tip was, the utopia is under threat. So she paints this picture of, it's hard science fiction. It's a fictional solar system, but there's a moon. And on the moon, this civilization has lived for hundreds of years as kind of like far left, an anarchist utopia. But now it's under threat from like the home world. So just like going back and rereading that book, I thought, all right, I want to paint this picture of the best worst case scenario, a utopia dystopia where the sea levels have risen, much of the middle of the earth is no longer inhabitable, people have moved to the poles. So when the book opens in Nuuk, the capital city of Greenland, which other urban planners have looked at as potentially the site of like a mega city in the future because it's far north, it's well above sea level, right? It's well above the sea, it's perched on cliffs. And when this book opens, you see like the kind of city that I would like to live in. We're talking about like public transportation, and everything is like co-housing, and there's community gardens where you bring your compost. Everything is worker owned. You get an idea of like there is very little kind of like corporate hierarchy. But then the threat to this utopia is once this wave of assassination starts, and the main character, Emmy, who's 15 years old, her mom disappears under suspicious circumstances. So that was kind of my blueprint for like, okay, that's how I'm going to write an exciting thriller utopia. And then since then, when you speak about dystopian novels, a lot of us, and again, this is from Kristen Godsey, who wrote this amazing book, Everyday Utopia. She starts looking into a lot of the novels that any of us who went to public school here in this country started reading from 6th grade, which is when I read The Giver by Lois Lowry, and then it was Animal Farm, and then it was 1984, and then it was Brave New World, and you might have Lord of the Flies thrown in there. And we were fed these dystopians, and what she points out is that these dystopias teach us is this message that if the world is terrible and you try to change it, you're going to make it worse, and you're going to be left alone and unloved, which is terrifying, especially when you're in 14 or 15 years old and all you want to do is belong, right, to people. And then we look at like Squid Games and Hunger Games, and we're fed so much dystopia, and it has this effect of weaponizing despair to immobilize us. And so she talks about like it really does have an effect on us. And then this is just, I just have to get into this because I just thought this was so fascinating. She talks about hope, which is from what a lot of like, I guess behavioral or cognitive scientists have looked into. Hope as cognitively the opposite of memory. So that memory is where we can place ourselves in the past. And we all know like our memories can atrophy, and we can do tasks to strengthen them. Like people have these memory challenges. And hope is the opposite of that, is us placing ourselves in the future. And there's been this research that's so interesting of hope alleviating stress and anxiety, kind of like hope therapies. And then collectively, hope is like, well, we're putting ourselves into the future, we're imagining ourselves in the future, what are the obstacles, how are we gonna get there? And no progress has ever been made without people first just hoping for it and imagining it. And so utopia kind of activates that process as well. So that's what's gotten me so excited about it, is seeing how it could have a role in creating a new world, like a world that I think a lot of us want. And so then it has made me seek out other utopias. I learned that Aldous Huxley wrote a utopia called Island shortly before his death. He wrote Brave New World as well. And then I've been trying to assemble a team utopia with other utopian fiction. So Allegra Hyde came out with a book called Eleutheria. It's a climate utopia. And there's a small collection, but I'm hoping that they're gonna grow a little bit. And I've gotten a lot of interest from TV and film studios, and nothing has come of it. What I've learned is that there's like a lot of interest, and we've had meetings, and they name drop a million, you know, they'll be like, it's really funny. It's so, it feels like very LA, where they'll be like, you know, like, oh, Steven Spielberg, we can make that call. Brad Pitt, easy call to make. We can do that, and then I just never hear from them again. But all of them mention that like, oh, we think people are hungry for like more hopeful stories. And so I'm just glad to hear that there's, I think maybe we've like, maybe we're full on dystopia and we're ready to move on. Yeah.
Octavia Butler, any sort of, from a different framework that's not white and...
Octavia Butler wrote so many amazing books, but wrote two books, the Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Tale, I believe. Is that it?
Balance.
Talents, thank you. And the first one, in the beginning of the book, in the epigraph, is a quote of hers. And I think that those two books are kind of not a trilogy, a duology. And they're a really great example of a dystopia, yes, utopia, where out of a really horrific, and in fact, that was an early climate dystopia, depicting the American West. Yeah, but she shows a utopia arising from that. And in fact, we see, like looking back through history, a lot of utopian movements come out of really bad times. Like Plato wrote The Republic right after the Peloponnesian Wars. I can't remember other times in history, but this happens often. And so I thought those two books in particular were amazing and really influential to me. Thanks for bringing those up.
If you wouldn't mind before we go.
Sure.
And wondering about if the transition town model that came out of the UK, is that somehow woven into your book, or is that just coincidental?
What I love about these conversations is I learn things that I'd never heard of before, such as the transition town. Dave, you're kind of nodding along. Do you know what this is?
No.
Oh, okay. Can you, I don't know what this is. Yeah, that's so fascinating. And also, this title, The Great Transition, is not, I have seen that phrase pop up in other novels and climate novels because it's not something I invented. It's like people talk about the Green New Deal, a climate victory plan, the Great Transition. It's kind of one of these terms that people use of an idea of what this mobilization could look like. So that's really exciting to hear about other movements around the world. Yeah. 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 Definitely. Yes. So Kim Stanley Robinson, the author of Ministry for the Future, studied underneath Ursula K. Le Guin. She was his mentor in many ways. And so he comes out of this literary utopian tradition. And all of the books I've read of his, I've loved all of them. They're all utopian in nature. Whether he has some that are projected hundreds of years into the future, where there's a federation of asteroids and planets all around the solar system, and it still has this like utopian drive of how is humanity bettering itself. And he has an amazing trilogy set in California that also is like starts with this very dystopian kind of hellscape and this utopian community growing out of it. So I definitely consider Ministry, thank you for mentioning that, as part of this like utopian, hopeful climate trend. Small but growing.
Maybe we could do another question or two and close with a short reading. If there was a reading you wanted
yeah,
to like, that
I'd
would
be
be
happy to.
a cool way to end. I'd like to insert myself in with a question, and I'll get you. Because it's still on this topic of the more literary side, and you've mentioned Ursula Le Guin, and Jess mentioned Octavia Butler, and Kim Stanley Robinson came up, and I would, throw in some of China Miéville's sort of speculative stuff, and whatever, any number of other authors, Aldous Huxley. I was actually wondering for Ania and Dave, sort of dystopia or utopia, do you find these stories, sort of fictional stories of our future, especially our climate future, do they impact your work? Does that help you imagine what you're working on? Dave, is it really only as a statistical prediction model the only future you want to think about? I mean, Ania, is it only sort of a political future of getting the Green New Deal passed? Like, what do fictional climate futures do for you, if anything? Positive or negative, dystopia or utopia?
Well, for me, I think humanity generally really struggles to envision experiences that we've never had before. And so that's the beauty of fiction in a lot of ways, and especially characterizing and designing an entire world, an entire kind of environment that we haven't seen before. Because we don't know what the future is going to look like, right? We know it's going to be different. We know, that there are going to be some things that are going to be more intense. But even if you walk along the Portland waterfront, going down and seeing the flooding at Jay's Oyster, a couple times a year, and telling people, no, that's going to happen every day of the year by the end of the century. That's a hard reality for people to really grasp, right? And what that means for their daily lives around here. So I do think, having these fictionalized worlds and sort of these designs about how life can persist and exist and thrive, frankly, is actually really helpful. We need that creative streak so, the linear thinkers like myself can really push our boundaries. Yeah.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, and I think books like Nick's are actually completely critical to the political and scientific side of things. I think, like Dave was just getting to, it allows a creative space to think about what's possible, and also like remind us as communities, as society, of like where we need to go, and provide some creative ideas of how to get there. Yeah, and I think, in my role as a political and legislative specialist, like I've thought about Kim Stanley Robinson's book in my work, And so I think it's something that I personally appreciate as someone that works in, you know, a more rigid space, to have things to refer to as, you know, utopias of where we're trying to get. Yeah.
Apologize if you stated this and I just didn't hear it. Sometimes voices dropped and I missed a bit of what all three of you said. But on the positive, pragmatic end of things that are going on in this state, I didn't hear you mention Efficiency Maine's programs. Part of, personally, I partook in today. They needed to come back and fix something. But for insulating, they will give even a greater amount if you're on general assistance, but if you're a homeowner for insulating, they will give between $4,000 and $6,500, $6,500 towards insulating. That's a huge chunk, and that's going on statewide. And window dressers, if people are unaware of window dressers, whether you're a homeowner or a renter, these are community builds that are very low cost, but they need people. Right now in Portland, they don't have one until February, which obviously we're missing a lot of the heating season. They haven't had one in Portland. I've been signed up since summer of last year. So they need people to go out and measure, volunteers to go out and measure, and volunteers to do these community builds. They've got the materials. It's a great program towards energy efficiency. Thanks.
I'm so glad that you brought that up. I think that's a piece that we didn't get to talk about as much tonight, but there's so much going on in Maine, whether it be Efficiency Maine programs or the work that Maine Youth for Climate Justice is doing, or GMRI is doing, or CR Club's doing, and there are so many opportunities to plug in, both to get assistance for yourself, but also to work with organizations, volunteer with groups like the CR Club, get plugged into the climate transition that we're having in Maine. So yeah, I appreciate that question or comment. And sorry you couldn't hear us the whole time.
And Nick, how long would you like to read for? Because maybe that should be now, or maybe we have time for one question before that.
I would read like 1.5 pages. How long?
I think there's time for a question then.
Oh yeah, definitely, yeah. I would rather hear a question than hear myself talk anyway.
You've talked a lot about like historical, like looking into the history, and I heard kind of an opinion, I read an opinion recently about how in the past it was sort of easier to make change because we weren't in this sort of like global place where like we're getting inundated with all this information, you know what I mean? And so like it was pretty easy in America, for example, in aerosol spray, when we like needed to stop using aerosol because it was affecting, you know, the ozone. And the opinion was such that like now we're getting inundated with so much information that like making real change is like too difficult. And also just curious about your thoughts about like real political and like corporate interest and how that plays into some of this like change that feels important.
Sure. And also what you bring up is really important. I think this is called the Montreal Protocols, where the world got together, realized like the ozone layer was disappearing, banned certain chemicals, and it's healed, right? Like I haven't heard about the ozone layer in a long time. So from what I've read, oil companies and fossil fuel companies really noticed what had happened there, because the exact same playbook was being used in the 80s to realize like, oh, carbon is creating this problem. We need to do the same thing that we did to save the ozone layer, to save the planet. And that's when like the fossil fuel industry really mobilized to start killing the Kyoto protocols in the 90s. Like they learned their lesson. So I just think though that, I don't know, I try to imagine like in like Europe during feudal times, like it must have seemed that it had gone on for hundreds of years. Like, how is this ever going to change? And then it does. And so I just have to believe that as tough as things seem now, that it's not, like, it's just so hard for me to accept that if in our whole species, in our whole history of our species, when we keep on transforming and changing and overcoming obstacles, that somehow we have stopped doing that at this exact moment when we need it most. Like, I think we just, I just can't believe it. Like, we have to be able to. And I think in the, we saw a lot of momentum and energy in the Bernie 2020 campaign, and like really challenging the corporate hold on both of the parties and in the country. And I think a lot of people never thought that that would even come as close as it did, and showed like what could be possible. I don't know. So even though that campaign didn't succeed, I did take a lot of hope of like, okay, this isn't as solid as it seems. So I can't let myself believe that we're done changing the world. Thanks for that question.
I think we gotta have the reading or the last question, one or the other, because we're almost out of time.
Talk after?
Okay.
The main character is, one of the main characters is Larch, and when he grows up north of Acadia, farming seaweed, and this is in the near future, and then Maine burns to the ground, basically as happened in 1947 or 1948, wildfires for months across the state, and I used a lot of that research for this book set in the near future. So Larch becomes a climate refugee. There's expected to be over 1 billion climate refugees in the coming decades, and people are flooding into Maine, as I don't know, I could see happening in the coming decades as the South gets hotter and hotter. And there's a lot of climate refugees, and then a polar vortex hits, it's freezing cold out, and he ends up in Bangor at the convention center, which in this book is called the Great Northern Greens Arena. And so he's been there for months. And he's going to talk just a little bit, you're going to hear him mention Emmy. So this is in the future, and Emmy is his daughter, who's 15 now, and she has to write a report for school on the Great Transition. So she's been interviewing her parents, and it's causing him to reflect on his time going through the climate crisis. Where was I when it happened? People always want to know. It was Emmy's first question when she interviewed me for her Great Transition project. Well, I was in the kitchen of the Great Northern Greens Arena, washing dishes after serving breakfast, and we heard shouts from outside. Everything got eerily quiet, and we rushed out. They had it on the Jumbotron, the West Antarctic ice sheet. Drones were streamcasting live. So much ice. Ice the size of Pennsylvania, they told us. Glaciers, 10,000 feet thick. An avalanche that continually slid into the ocean for days on days. Scientists had been warning for years, but the collapse was still a shock. The seas were going to rise. There was nothing anyone could do about it. Emmy asked if I cried. She knows how easily I tear up, but I do not remember crying. Nobody did. The news was too big to absorb, and for me, what could the crisis take that it had not taken already? I was a dry well, and I had work to do. Everyone in the arena was digesting breakfast. Soon they'd be hungry for lunch. Someone had to get on meal prep. Well, things moved quickly after that. Not as quickly as we should have, Emmy points out, but still. Partly it was luck. It happened to be an election year. People were desperate, fed up, and the old parties had so spectacularly failed. People who had never had a reason to vote were lining up to throw the bums out, to cast a ballot for something new, anything. Like most, I've never heard of the People's Party. Apparently they'd been around for years, earning a steady 2 to 3% of the vote. This time, they went up and down. And the People's Party made promises like all parties do, that the difference was they delivered. They established a new Department of Emergency Transition. And less than 2 months later, the first recruiter arrived at the Great Northern Greens Arena to make his pitch. They needed 20 million volunteers to save the world. The Great Transition, they were calling it. The largest mobilization in human history. He promised we would be legends. They would tell stories about us for generations to come. He was pacing a makeshift stage at half court, wearing a sharp jumpsuit and combat boots and mirrored aviators and a chunky watch. And I remember getting choked up as he asked if we would stand for the future together or drown alone. The greatest war in history was at our doorstep. What would we tell our grandchildren when they asked what we did at the 11th hour? To the choice was up to me. I say me because it felt like the recruiter was speaking to me directly. He was good, and it helped that he had music booming behind him and the arena screens projecting wildfires and screeching eagles and American flags, all orchestrated to create a strong effect on impressionable youth. And as one such impressionable youth, I can tell you, it worked. Everything that I had been told about fighting and joining a team and helping as the only way, well, here it was dropped into my lap. I signed up for a 7-month deployment on the spot. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Nick and Ania and Dave, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
And,
Yeah,
we'll
and to the
see you
Portland
next
Public
time.
Library, the Utopia headquarters for a great city. Thank you all.